In a move that sent shockwaves through international markets, China made a dramatic announcement that would alter the landscape of global seafood commerce. The decision to completely halt all seafood imports from Japan didn't just affect two nations, it triggered a cascade of economic consequences that rippled across continents, creating winners and losers in ways few could have predicted. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within days of the announcement, Japanese seafood shipments that were already en route to Chinese ports found themselves suddenly unwanted. Containers packed with premium catches were turned away. Contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars evaporated overnight, and an entire industry found itself facing an uncertain future. Industry analysts quickly calculated the damage. Japan stood to lose more than $500 million in revenue over the coming 12 months alone. For the fishing communities dotting Japan's extensive coastline, particularly those in regions like Hokkaido and Kyushu, the news struck with the force of a tsunami. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They represented livelihoods, generational businesses, and entire towns built around the seafood trade. Fishermen who had spent decades building relationships with Chinese buyers watched helplessly as their primary market disappeared virtually overnight. But as one door slammed shut, another appeared to crack open, at least for some. Thousands of miles away, in the bustling seafood processing centers along India's vast coastline, a very different reaction was unfolding. Exporters and industry executives began running calculations, making phone calls, and drafting proposals. If China needed to replace Japanese seafood imports, surely this represented an unprecedented opportunity for Indian suppliers to step into the void. The timing seemed almost providential from India's perspective. The country's seafood industry had been reeling from a different blow entirely: the punishing tariffs imposed by the United States under the Trump administration's aggressive trade policies. What had once been a thriving export relationship had become economically unviable almost overnight, leaving Indian seafood companies desperately searching for alternative markets. China's sudden need appeared to be the perfect solution. But was it really that simple? Could India genuinely step into Japan's shoes and capture a significant portion of the Chinese seafood market? Or were there fundamental mismatches that would prevent this seemingly logical substitution from actually occurring? To understand the answer, we need to examine not just the economics of seafood trade, but the complex interplay of geography, quality standards, consumer preferences, and international politics that shape this multi-billion-dollar industry. India's hidden strength: a seafood powerhouse. When most people think of India, seafood exports don't typically come to mind. The images that dominate popular perception are far different. Crowded urban centers, vibrant street food scenes featuring aromatic curries, perhaps the occasionally viral photograph of impossibly overcrowded trains with passengers clinging to every available surface. Yet beneath these surface-level impressions lies a sophisticated and massive seafood industry that few outside the trade fully appreciate. India's geography tells the first part of this story. Look at any map and you'll see that the Indian subcontinent is embraced by water on three sides, with a coastline that stretches across more than 7,500 kilometers. This isn't just any coastline, it's positioned in tropical waters that rank among the most biologically diverse marine environments on the planet. The warm waters surrounding India create ideal conditions for rapid marine growth and extraordinary species diversity. To the west, the Arabian Sea offers high salinity waters perfect for cultivating large commercial fish species. Travel to India's eastern shores, and you'll find the Bay of Bengal, its nutrient-rich waters teeming with some of the world's most abundant shrimp populations. This unique positioning means India effectively benefits from the characteristics of two distinct oceanic systems, making it a natural powerhouse for seafood production. The numbers bear this out. India's fishery resources currently span an area of 34,000 square kilometers. Its proximity to the Indian Ocean, one of the world's most critical maritime corridors, provides additional advantages that go beyond mere fishing. Offshore operations become significantly more efficient, while export transportation costs drop substantially compared to landlocked competitors or those situated far from major shipping routes. Over the past decade, the Indian government has recognized this natural advantage and invested heavily to capitalize on it. Fishery bases have been expanded and modernized. Aquaculture farms have been developed with increasing sophistication. Cold chain logistics networks have been constructed to maintain product quality from catch to consumer. Processing facilities have been upgraded to meet international standards. Alongside these physical investments, policy support has flowed through subsidies and tax incentives designed to make Indian seafood more competitive in global markets. The results have been impressive by any measure. According to the most recent official data from 2024, India's total seafood exports reached approximately $7.4 billion, with total export volumes hitting 1.7 million tons. These products found their way to markets across the globe: the United States, China, the European Union, and throughout Southeast Asia. The United States had long served as India's primary customer, consistently absorbing roughly 35% of all Indian seafood exports. Within India's diverse product portfolio, one category dominated above all others: shrimp. More specifically, white leg shrimp, which alone accounted for approximately 70% of total export value. In 2024, nearly half of all Indian shrimp exports, 47%, were destined for American consumers. These crustaceans embarked on a remarkable journey. Harvested from farms along the Arabian Sea coast, they were processed, frozen, and loaded onto refrigerated containers. Their route took them across the Mediterranean, through the Atlantic Ocean, and finally to the east coast of the United States, a voyage lasting roughly 25 days from farm to American port. But this carefully constructed export machine was about to face its greatest challenge. The disruption came swiftly and with little warning. When Donald Trump returned to the presidency, he brought with him an aggressive trade agenda designed to reshape America's economic relationships with trading partners around the world. India, despite being viewed as a strategic partner in many contexts, was not exempted from this new approach. On July 31st, the Trump administration signed an executive order that would fundamentally alter the economics of Indian exports to the United States. The directive was clear. Starting August 7th, the vast majority of Indian goods entering America would face a 25% tariff. For Indian exporters who had built their business models around competitive pricing, this alone represented a severe blow. But the Trump administration wasn't finished. Just one day before the initial tariffs were set to take effect, on August 6th, another 25% was added. The justification this time centered on India's continued direct and indirect imports of Russian oil, a practice the United States was determined to penalize. When these two tariff layers were combined, Indian products suddenly faced an effective tariff rate of 50%. The date these tariffs officially took effect, August 27th, became a day of reckoning for Indian exporters. The tariff structure had been deliberately designed to target labor-intensive, low-value-added export industries. Apparel manufacturers, leather goods producers, furniture makers, and seafood processors all found themselves in the crosshairs. These were precisely the sectors where India had competed through cost efficiency rather than brand premium or unique technology. The basic mathematics of international trade made the problem obvious. Indian companies had spent years, sometimes decades, perfecting the art of delivering acceptable quality at the lowest possible price point. A 50% tariff didn't just reduce profitability, it fundamentally eliminated the competitive advantage these companies had worked so hard to establish. Products that had been competitively priced one day became economically unviable the next. For India's seafood industry, the impact was particularly devastating. Remember, the United States represented roughly one-third of India's total seafood export market. This wasn't a minor customer that could be easily replaced. It was the foundation upon which much of the industry had been built. The damage rippled through every level of the supply chain. Aquaculture operations that had expanded to meet American demand suddenly faced the prospect of having nowhere to sell their harvest. Processing plants that had invested in equipment and certification specifically for the U.S. market saw their business models collapse. Cold chain logistics providers watched their utilization rates plummet. Packaging suppliers, transportation companies, port operators, everyone connected to the seafood export ecosystem felt the tremors. Frozen shrimp, that crown jewel of Indian seafood exports, was hit hardest of all. Major American retailers like Walmart had been key buyers, placing large, consistent orders that provided stability and predictability to Indian suppliers. Once the 50% tariff kicked in, those orders simply stopped coming. Contracts were canceled. Future shipments were indefinitely postponed. The pipeline that had carried billions of dollars in commerce suddenly ran dry. By October, the data painted a grim picture. India's seafood exports to the United States had fallen 9% year over year. But the statistics told only part of the story. Behind those numbers were millions of jobs, from coastal fishing villages to urban processing centers, that had become dangerously precarious. The Indian government, recognizing the severity of the crisis, responded with a $5 billion relief package specifically targeting export-oriented industries like seafood and textiles. While this emergency funding provided crucial short-term breathing room, everyone in the industry understood that government subsidies couldn't be a permanent solution. The fundamental problem remained. Indian seafood exporters needed to find new markets capable of absorbing the enormous volumes that America had previously purchased. It was at precisely this moment, with Indian seafood companies desperately seeking alternatives, that news broke about China's ban on Japanese seafood imports. The timing seemed almost too perfect to be coincidental. The Chinese opportunity, or was it? China represents everything an export-oriented industry could wish for in a customer. With a population of 1.4 billion people and rapidly growing middle and upper classes, China stands as the world's second-largest seafood importer. In 2024 alone, Chinese consumers and businesses purchased approximately $18 billion worth of imported seafood. The scale of this market is difficult to overstate. Despite having one of the world's most developed domestic aquaculture industries, China simply cannot produce enough seafood domestically to satisfy its population's appetite. From everyday family meals to high-end restaurant dining, seafood plays a central role in Chinese culinary culture across all economic strata. Within this massive market, Japan had long occupied a privileged position. Japanese seafood wasn't just another import option, it represented a premium category all its own. Before the ban, Japan exported roughly $560 million worth of seafood to mainland China annually. But the value extended far beyond the dollar figures. Japanese suppliers had become synonymous with quality in specific high-end categories. Shellfish from Hokkaido, meticulously harvested mollusks, premium sea cucumbers prized for both culinary and traditional medicine applications. These products commanded premium prices and enjoyed strong brand recognition among Chinese consumers. Walk into any upscale Japanese restaurant in Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangzhou, and the assumption was that the seafood on your plate originated from Japanese waters. This perception of quality wasn't accidental. Products like Hokkaido scallops, fresh sea urchin, and premium-grade tuna had become almost instinctively associated with Japanese excellence in the minds of Chinese consumers. The name Japan on a seafood product functioned almost like a luxury brand, signaling not just origin, but a certain standard of freshness, taste, and safety. Then, in November of 2025, everything changed. Remarks made by Japan's Prime Minister, comments that struck a nerve in Beijing, triggered a diplomatic crisis that quickly escalated to concrete economic consequences. China announced an immediate and complete halt to all seafood imports from Japan. The implementation was swift and uncompromising. Within days, approximately 4 tons of Japanese seafood that had already arrived at Chinese ports, goods that had cleared all previous inspections and were ready for distribution, were unceremoniously sent back. Every confirmed order, regardless of where it stood in the fulfillment process, was canceled immediately. For a market as large and sophisticated as China's, which had built extensive import relationships over decades, this kind of sudden, complete disruption was extraordinary. It created an immediate vacuum, a gap in supply that would need to be filled somehow. High-end restaurants that had built their menus around Japanese ingredients suddenly needed alternatives. Importers who had specialized in Japanese products scrambled to identify replacement sources. Consumers accustomed to certain products found them simply unavailable. For Indian seafood exporters watching these developments unfold, the situation looked like a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Here was one of the world's largest markets suddenly cut off from a major supplier. Here was India's industry, battered by American tariffs and desperately seeking new customers. The logic seemed inescapable. India should immediately position itself to capture the market share Japan had just lost. Industry associations in India quickly mobilized. Trade delegations were organized. Marketing materials were prepared. Proposals were drafted highlighting India's capacity, competitive pricing, and eagerness to become China's new preferred supplier. There was genuine optimism, even excitement, in certain quarters of the Indian seafood industry. But this optimism was about to collide with some uncomfortable realities. The enthusiastic Indian response was based on a logical fallacy that becomes obvious once you examine what Japan was actually selling to China versus what India had available to offer. This wasn't simply about filling a gap in seafood supply, it was about understanding that not all seafood products are interchangeable. Japan's exports to China had been heavily weighted toward high-value premium products. We're talking about wild-caught scallops from the cold, pristine waters off Hokkaido, bluefin tuna from established fisheries, carefully handled and processed for sashimi consumption, sea cucumbers harvested using traditional methods and processed to exacting standards. These weren't commodity products competing primarily on price. They were specialty items where origin, handling, and quality commanded premium pricing. These products served specific markets within China. They went to high-end Japanese restaurants where authenticity and quality were paramount. They supplied sushi establishments where the fish would be consumed raw, requiring absolute confidence in handling and freshness. They catered to affluent households for whom the Japanese origin itself was part of the product's appeal. They filled gift boxes during important holidays, where the prestige of the brand mattered as much as the product itself. Indian seafood, by contrast, occupies an entirely different market segment. The overwhelming focus of India's export industry is frozen shrimp, particularly white-leg shrimp. This is fundamentally a mass-market product. It competes in supermarket freezer sections and wholesale markets where volume and price are the primary considerations. These products are meant to be cooked, not consumed raw. They target everyday family meals, not special occasions or high-end dining experiences. The farming environments and processing standards also differ significantly. Japan's reputation for meticulous quality control, attention to detail, and stringent food safety standards is well established globally. These aren't just marketing claims. They're reflected in traceability systems, processing protocols, and testing regimes that have been refined over decades. In the Chinese market specifically, consumer perceptions about food safety and origin carry enormous weight. This is particularly true in higher income brackets and for products consumed raw or lightly cooked. A country's overall sanitation standards, food safety track record, and regulatory environment heavily influence how its food exports are perceived. Japan benefited enormously from positive perceptions in all these areas. India, fairly or not, does not enjoy the same reputation.
Chinese consumers shopping for high-end seafood are not typically seeking out Indian origin products. The brand association simply doesn't exist in the same way. An expensive sushi restaurant in Shanghai isn't going to start sourcing its tuna from India just because Japanese supplies became unavailable. It's far more likely to look to other established premium suppliers or simply remove certain items from the menu. Beyond these perception issues, there are practical incompatibilities. Much of Japan's seafood export to China was consumed as sashimi, raw or barely prepared. This requires not just freshness, but specific handling protocols from the moment of catch. Water temperature management, time from catch to processing, the specific techniques used in butchering and preparation. All of these factors matter tremendously for sashimi-grade products. Indian seafood processing, optimized for frozen products that will be cooked, simply doesn't operate with sashimi consumption as the primary goal. The farming environments, while suitable for producing good quality cooked seafood, don't necessarily produce products ideal for raw consumption. This isn't a criticism of Indian seafood. It's simply a recognition that different products serve different purposes and different markets. So while India might theoretically increase its seafood exports to China, the idea that it could meaningfully replace Japan's role in the Chinese market was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what that market actually entailed.
Even if we set aside the premium product mismatch, India faces another formidable barrier to significantly expanding its seafood exports to China: China's own domestic seafood industry. This might seem counterintuitive given that China is such a large importer. But China's position in global aquaculture is often underestimated by those outside the industry. China isn't just a major producer, it's the dominant force in global aquaculture, particularly in the exact category where India focuses most of its export efforts: white-leg shrimp. The scale of China's shrimp farming operations is truly staggering. In provinces like Hainan and Shandong, as well as virtually every coastal region with suitable conditions, massive shrimp farming operations have been established. These aren't small, artisanal operations, they're industrial-scale facilities utilizing sophisticated farming techniques, automated feeding systems, and carefully controlled environments. China's annual production of white-leg shrimp exceeds 1.6 million tons. To put that in perspective, this represents approximately 38% of total global production of this species. This isn't an industry in its infancy or one that Chinese companies are still learning to master. It's a mature, highly efficient, technologically sophisticated sector that has benefited from decades of investment and refinement. The cost structure of Chinese domestic production is also remarkably competitive. With production happening within the country, there are no international shipping costs, no import duties, no currency exchange risks. The logistics are simplified, allowing for shorter time to market and potentially fresher product. The regulatory environment is familiar and navigable for domestic producers. For an Indian exporter looking to sell frozen white-leg shrimp into the Chinese market, this domestic competition presents an almost insurmountable challenge. Why would Chinese buyers import frozen shrimp from India, paying for international shipping, dealing with import procedures, and accepting longer supply chains, when comparable products are being produced domestically in enormous volumes at competitive prices? The answer, of course, is that in most cases, they wouldn't. Unless Indian suppliers could offer some combination of dramatically lower prices, noticeably superior quality, or unique product attributes that Chinese domestic producers couldn't match, there's simply no compelling reason for Chinese buyers to choose Indian imports over domestic supply. This dynamic explains why India's existing exports to China, while not insignificant, have never approached the scale of its exports to markets like the United States or the European Union. It's not that Chinese buyers are unaware of Indian seafood. It's that for the products India primarily exports, there's intense domestic competition that didn't exist in other markets. Beyond market positioning and domestic competition, there are also legitimate concerns about quality control and food safety standards that have historically plagued India's seafood export industry. These issues, while not universal across the entire sector, have been serious enough to trigger official actions by Chinese authorities. The problems trace back to the structure of India's seafood farming industry. Unlike China's large-scale, often corporate-operated farms, India's industry is heavily fragmented. Small and medium-sized operations account for approximately 70% of production. While this distributed structure has certain advantages, it also creates significant challenges for maintaining consistent quality and safety standards. Many smaller operators simply cannot afford the investments required for proper water purification systems, comprehensive sanitation protocols, and regular disinfection procedures. The economics of small-scale farming often force difficult choices between ideal practices and financially viable ones. The result has been recurring problems with product quality and safety. India's cold chain infrastructure has also lagged behind the requirements of a modern seafood export industry,